When cells are stimulated effectively, action potential can be produced. What kind of changes will happen when cells are stimulated by subthreshold? When cells are stimulated by subthreshold, a small amplitude of membrane potential changes will be produced locally, which is called local potential. How is the local potential produced? A small amount of intracellular sodium channel are activated when a small amount of sodium ion is activated. Because of the small change of local excitation membrane potential and the rapid outflow of potassium ions, the cell membrane quickly returns to the resting potential level. Therefore, the local potential evoked by subthreshold stimulation cannot induce action potential. A stimulus applied to a nerve may or may not initiate action potential. With a subthreshold stimulus, a localized membrane depolarization appears at the site of stimulation, which is called a local response. It is only spread a few millimeters, which is called electronic conduction. Graded potentials are changed in membrane potential that are confined to the relatively small region of the plasma membrane. They are usually produced by some specific change in cell's environment acting on a specialized region of the membrane. They are called graded potential, simply because the magnitude of the potential change can vary. Whenever a graded potential occurs, charge follows between the place origin of this action and adjacent region of the plasma membrane, which still at the rising potential. Thus, the signal is moved along the membrane. Three characteristics of the graded potential are as follows. Graded magnitude. Depending upon the initiating event, graded potential can occur in either a depolarizing or a hypolarizing direction, and their magnitude is related to the magnitude of the initiating event. Electronic propagation. The graded potential decreases with distance and functions as signals only over a very short distance, a few millimeters. Summation. If additional stimulus occur before the graded potential has died away, this can be added to the depolarization from the first stimulus. Summation, spatial summation. Some local response elicited by different subthreshold stimulated in nearby parts can summated and initiate an action potential. Temporal summation. If additional stimulus occur before the graded potential have died away, this can be added to the depolarization from the first stimulus and initiate action potential. Initiation of the action potential. The very first part of the polarization, that the graded potential, is due to the local current through the channel that have been opened by stimuli. As the depolarization starts, potassium still exists sodium entry, but as the stimulus continues to add current to the inside of the cell, the depolarization increases and more and more voltage-gated sodium channels open, allowing the influx of sodium ions to increase more than potassium ion leaving the cell. Once enough sodium ion enter the cell, depolarization reaches the threshold potential, and a sudden opening of the voltage-gated sodium channel occurs. This is positive feedback circle responsible for the rising phases of action potential. From this moment on, the membrane potential changes are independent of the initial stimulus, driven entirely by action of the channels, and an action potential occurs. A sudden rise in the membrane potential of 15 to 30 millivolts usually is required to reach the threshold potential. So the level of minus 55 millivolts is said to be the threshold potential, which is usually 10 to 20 millivolts less than the resting potential. Propagation of the action potential. An action potential potent elicited at any one point on an excitable membrane usually excites adjacent portion of the membrane, resulting in the propagation of the action potential over the membrane. Mechanism. Local circuits of current follow theory. Local circuits refers to ones exist between the depolarized area and the adjacent resting area. Current follow means the diffusion of the electrical charge ions between the depolarized area and the adjacent resting area. Remote diffusion of the sodium at the depolarized area of the membrane potential. Membrane local diffusion of the sodium from the depolarized area to the adjacent resting area inside the cell in both directions, changing the adjacent resting potential to the varying level, initiating action potential in the adjacent area or on both sides. This process is repeated again and again to induce propagation of action potential in whole cell. Solitary conduction of action potential in myelinated nerve fibers. Characteristics. Action potential can only occur at the nodes because ions cannot flow significantly through the thick myelin threads. The local current can only flow from node to node, exciting successive nodes one after another. So, no action potential jump down the fiber, which is the origin of the term saltatory. Physiological significance. It increases the velocity of nerve conduction in myelinated fiber as much as 5-fold to 50-fold. It converts energy for the axon because the last membrane of the axon needed to be excited, that the little energy is required for re-establishing the sodium and potassium concentration gradients across the membrane. Excitation and excitability of tissues. Excitation and excitable cell. Excitation is the response of cell to stimuli. It is the action potential, or the process that action potential produced. Nerve cell, muscle cells, and globular cells as well. Some endocrine, immune, and reproductive cells are excitable cells because they are able to produce action potential when excited. The ability of cell to produce action potential is excitability. Excitability and threshold stimulus in most conditions, changing the intensity of the stimulus with variable duration of stimulus and the rate of the change is used to determine the excitability of the cell. The minimal intensity of the stimulus to cause action potential of cells is called threshold intensity. This stimulus is called threshold stimulus. The subthreshold stimulus means the stimulus is lower than the threshold stimulus, while the suprathreshold stimulus is higher. In other words, both suprathreshold and threshold stimuli cause action potential, but subthreshold stimulus does not. The threshold intensity of the threshold stimulus is used as index to evaluate excitability. The excitability varies inversely to the threshold intensity. That is, the lower the threshold intensity of a cell, the higher the excitability. A series of excitability alternation after excitation. The excitability of cell undergoes a series of alternation after the action potential initiates. During the action potential, a second stimulus, no matter how strong, will not produce a second action potential, and the membrane is said to be in its absolute refractory period. This occurs when voltage-gated sodium channels are open and when the activation gate or the voltage-gated sodium channel blocks the channel at the peak of the action potential. The activation gates that have clogged these channels must be removed before the channel can reopen to the second stimulus. Following the absolute refractory period, there is an interval duration during which is the second active action potential can be produced, but only if the stimulus strength is considerably greater than the Europe. This is the relative refractory period, which can last 1 to 15 milliseconds or longer and coincides roughly with the period of the hypolarization. During the relative refractory period, some but not all the voltage-gated sodium channel have returned to the resting state, and an increased number of the potassium channel are open. If a new depolarization is large enough to reach the threshold potential or outlast the relative refractory period, additional action potentials will be fired. However, because of the after hypolarization, the magnitude of the depolarization needed to reach threshold potential is greater than normal. The refractory period limits the number of action potential that can be produced by an excitable membrane in a given period of time. For example, at the refractory period is 2 milliseconds, the maximal frequency of action potential should be 500 times per second. Summarize the content of this section. This section introduces action potential and local potential. Let's compare them. Action potential is triggered by threshold or suprathreshold stimulation. Reaching the threshold potential, a large number of sodium channels open, and the flow of sodium ions. The local potential is caused by the subthreshold stimulation. A small amount of sodium channel opening. The action potential is characterized by the potential of all or none. Non-attenuation conduction. The characteristics of local potential are hierarchical potential and no non-response period. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.